So good afternoon and good morning because um, uh, some people wrote me from Chicago, from Democratic Republic of Congo. So we have people from, especially from Italy, okay, but also from other countries. And I'm very happy because some friends are are joined with us. For example, uh, Ana Lopez Sala from Spain is a very important scholar on migration in Europe and in space in Europe and other friends. And so I am very happy to be here with Jason that I meet again after 2 weeks after a conversation about his new book in Italian with Ombre Corte publisher titled Beyond the Climate Justice Tower, an ecology of revolution. And so we have in Italy a national, so-called national PhD on climate change and sustainability. And in this PhD with 6 big areas, we have a curriculum on humanity and social sciences. Okay, and in this curriculum, named Theories, Institutions, and Cultures, I propose this seminar series for a political ecology of migration, immobility, green colonialism, and socio-ecological transformations. We have 5 meetings. The first one is now with Jason, and the other 4 will be with Amsa Mushin on next 18 April, and with Ana Maria Lopez Sala from CSIC in Spain on 22 April, with my great friend Joan Molinero Gerbeau, that also Jason knows because we coordinate 2 numbers of international relations. Yes, Relaciones Internacionales on Holocene and World Ecology Approach, and Anna Marie Garrapa from Università of Salerno, where I work as sociologist. And so the idea shared with Jason is very simple. Jason can speak or as a presentation of between 45 and 60 minutes, no, Jason? And then we have a debate. Microphones are open. We are not in a war regime in these seminars. Only not in these seminars, because we live in a war regime. But in the seminars, microphones are open. If someone wants open the webcam, it's possible. And so we have 45 a presentation by Jason, and then not only a question and answers round, but also commentaries, critiques, a debate, as in World Ecology Network, we say a conversation. No, Jason? Okay. So if people agree, we record our meeting also for other people to share it with other people, also in this PhD program, but also beyond this PhD program. Okay, grazie, Jason.
What a pleasure it is to be here this morning, or your afternoon. It is always a great honor and pleasure to be engaged with my dear comrade Gennaro. and to be in conversation with wonderful scholars of transnational migration who certainly know far more than I do about these questions. My intention here is to join a dialogue so that, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit of feedback from somebody's microphone. So if you can close the microphones while I'm speaking, that would be fantastic. What I would like to do is to join this dialogue over the intricate relations between class, labor, and geopolitics in the web of life with an eye towards the present conjuncture, but to conceptualize the present as a world historical moment. And therefore, I want to speak to some of the deeper conceptual, but also importantly, ideological questions that shape our research and that push us as radicals and as revolutionaries towards what Lenin called the theoretical struggle. And the first thing that we want to be aware of is that the Holocene, which is a 19th century concept, and we'll return to why that's significant in a little bit, is coming to an end. This long period of relative climate stability. It is a period of long relative stability in part because, as Ruddiman has demonstrated, class societies carbonize the atmosphere starting around 6,000, 7,000 years ago. So the dawn of class society, of the urban and agricultural revolutions, and atmospheric carbonization and methanization were closely bound. In other words, climate history is a history not of man and nature as bourgeois apologists would have it, as the Anthropocene today would have it, but rather one of class historical relations and class historical conjunctures. Why should that be significant? Well, because as we see here from two rough proxies of climate history in the Northern Hemisphere over the past 2,000 years, moments of significantly favorable and significantly unfavorable climate change are bound up with moments of civilizational crisis, of class restructuring, of transitions within modes of production and transitions between modes of production. Don't worry, there's a lot of information here. We'll have a chance to revisit these themes as we run through this talk. One of the consequences of bourgeois naturalism is to erase the class struggle from the web of life and to present the history of climate in particular and the environment in general as a non-class phenomenon. Not only a non-class phenomenon, but an anti-class phenomenon, one that legitimates the removal of class. Today, this is even widespread on the left as people invoke colonialism, but somehow forget that colonialism was the bourgeoisie's preferred mode of organizing the class struggle. And for what are they organizing the class struggle? Well, ultimately, as
Jason,
Yep.
Jason, someone write that they cannot see the slide. Okay.
Yes, okay.
Okay.
Yeah. And why the erasure of the class struggle? Because that is the one thing that the ruling classes of the world do not want us to think about and act upon. And so today we have all of this decolonial discourse, some of which is outstanding and understands the class dynamics, much of which has licensed a removal of class dynamics, and that prevents us from understanding how class and empire, racism and sexism, and webs of life are all fitting together. We'll come back to all of these themes, so if I seem to move quickly, don't despair. I will continue to circle back and through these moments. The first key element of our understanding, if we want to begin to understand what is happening with world labor, with the world proletariat, the planetary proletariat, and cross-border migration, is that we need to understand the longue durée class historical dynamics of civilizations over the past 2,000 years, and indeed even farther. We can go back to the Bronze Age crisis right around 1200 BCE. Almost all of these involve, I would say axiomatically, all of these involve the large-scale movements of people across very large spaces. And we should keep that in mind, that the migration question, the class question, the climate question are all moments in what Marx would call a rich totality of many determinations. However, that rich totality is completely ruled out by the dominant standpoint of the bourgeoisie. This is man, nature, and climate. You all know this under the sign of the Anthropocene. I am personally embarrassed for Marxists who continue to write in the Capitalocene, in the Anthropocene, instead of in the Capitalocene. And I'll be clear about why that is so embarrassing for anyone who calls herself or himself a Marxist in just a moment. So this is the conventional moment. Human influences on global temperature. This, of course, is tied to the ideological claim of anthropogenic climate change, human activity. Of course, humanity is not a historical actor. There is no human enterprise, as the Anthropocene says, a term they take from the horrible Paul Ehrlich of population bomb fame from 1968. There is no human enterprise. There are states, there are political parties, there are corporations, there are churches, many other social organizations. These make history. Humanity does not make history. Of course, of all the agencies of the modern world, it is capital and its manifold expressions in states, in parties, in militaries, in financial systems, etc., that have shaped planetary life. We know that the climate is changing not because of anthropogenic factors, which is an ideological claim, but because of capital-ogenic factors. This is incredibly clear, and yet even many people on the left continue to use the phrase anthropogenic. Anthropogenic is a key pillar of bourgeois ideology. It has been in circulation since the end of the 19th century, and it relates to the trinity of the civilizing project from Columbus onwards of man, nature, and civilization. It's also problematic, as many people have noted, because of its collision model of historical change, in which linear causation, rather than dialectical emergence and the explanation of how climate, class, and empire, for example, fit together not as separate building blocks, but as what Marx and Engels call moments. They are part of these rich totalities of many determinations. Amongst the great and important methodological, but also epistemological and ontological arguments of Marx and Engels is that there are no essences, that essences are historical. And we're going to get into that more and more. So the Anthropocene purports to designate a human essence that then acts upon the world. A more audacious fetishization of the world would be hard to imagine. So when we ask why the erasure of class revolts in climate crises, part of the reason is that the man, nature, and civilization framework is intellectually incapable of dealing with this question, is ideologically designed to erase class, and is the intellectual or scientific expression of the bourgeois ideologies that initially formed in the 16th and 17th centuries. The counter tendency, as Marx and Engels would like to say, is found in historical materialism in the web of life. Now, for those who have read Marx and those who have not, many people usually skip over this foundational statement of historical materialism. Here we see Marx talking about how written history must set out, all historical writing must set out from these natural bases, the geological, the climatological, etc., and their modification in the history of class society. This is crucial. This is not the first moment like a context that we can then forget. It is an ongoing and active relation, as they demonstrate just a few pages later when they talk about the production of life, both of one's own in labor, daily reproduction, and a fresh life in procreation, intergenerational reproduction, now appears as a twofold relation. On the one hand as natural, on the other as social. And crucial to this is not only the insight of the fundamental socio-ecological character of class society, but also that it speaks to the possibilities for communism or the communist horizon in their work. That is, it speaks to the cooperation of the labor process and therefore the possibility that cooperation could itself become a productive force. We'll keep moving here. So to summarize Marx and Engels' historical materialism in this light is to identify it as a shorthand as a labor theory of life. That is, class struggle is an ontological premise, not a specific event or isolated process. It is against what they call in the manifesto, man in general. So the very fundamental objection of historical materialism is to the bourgeois ideology of bourgeois humanism, of this idea of man in general. This is the point of his sixth thesis on Feuerbach. It is a labor metabolic synthesis in which labor is a specifically harnessed natural force and undergoes fundamental transformations through environment making. Yes.
People say here, slides are not passing. Maybe Pablo say that you have to share the color screen. I don't know.
I have to share the color screen.
Okay. Pablo, okay.
Pablo, so what do I need to do, Pablo? We'll get there. Is it showing now?
Jason, I think you're sharing the wrong screen because you're sharing the PowerPoint and not sharing the whole screen. So maybe you have to switch off the share of the screen and switch on again the sharing screen.
Okay, so can you see, what do you see right now?
No, I'm watching the 16th slide right now.
Okay, correct. So that's
okay,
what we are
in the labor theory of life.
Okay.
If you click that, click again. No, so no, you're sharing the program, not the screen. So what you're watching right now is not the same thing that we're watching right now.
Okay.
So because you're sharing the program, not your screen, you have to switch off the application, and I mean the and again, when you share the screen, you have to share the whole screen.
Okay, so now I'm going to share.
Yeah,
don't worry.
You have to choose screen, not program, screen.
I see. I'm sorry. Now I understand, I believe. And hold on.
Sorry
Pablo,
to interrupt.
Thank you. No, that's quite necessary. So now
you have to take the PowerPoint and then.
Okay. Oh, great.
Pablo, thank you. Tell me.
That's it. That's it. Keep going. Thank you.
My apologies to everyone. And thank you, Pablo. It is always good to be interrupted when there is something not working. Okay. So here, to make a long story short, this is Engels writes Labor Created Man. This is in the famous essay on the role of labor in the transition from ape to man. This is a labor theory of life. Labor creates man. The evolutionary process is driven by labor processes, a view that has now been amply confirmed by scholars. And the upshot of this is that human nature is fundamentally historical. It is constituted through what Marx calls the ensembles of social relations that are embedded in modes of life. This is a labor theory of life. This is fundamental to world ecology and the standpoint of the proletariat, although not quite in the ways that Lukács imagined. And what does it tend towards? Well, Marx summarized this as well in the manuscripts, that natural science will in time incorporate itself into the science of man. The social reality of nature and human natural science, or the natural science of man, are identical terms. This is the argument for what Dietzken would call, in the early 20th century, proletarian science. It is also the gist and genesis of the world ecology perspective, a conversation, as Gennaro properly emphasized. And this foregrounds the worldwide class struggle in the web of life, a labor theory of life. And if you've come across these misleading characterizations of my work as somehow not having to do with class or labor, and the kind of ultra-left or populist posturing of somebody like Andreas Malm. In fact, Andreas Malm does not take the web of life seriously, or Marx and Engels' historical materialism seriously, in coming to grips with class formation and class struggle across the history of capitalism. And of course, this is fundamental. When Marx is writing about the specific economic form of unpaid surplus labor, he is not making an argument for one specific formal structure, but for a dynamic pattern that is itself evolutionary in a dialectical sense, not in a bourgeois sense, of the class relations in question. So these are the elements for a world ecological reading of the standpoint of the proletariat. Now, where are we today? And we're going to go back and forth between the present moment and the long history of capitalism as a world ecology. Well, first of all, let's recognize that climate migration is misleading and accurate at the same time. Migration within and across boundaries is not the direct outcome of anthropogenic climate change. Of course, that's a formulation that is deeply ideological. It is the result of the imperial bourgeoisie's expulsion of labor in production and from the potential conditions of capitalist production, the land. Today, this is the fateful synergy of enclosures, American regime change, and climate change. These are not separate building blocks. They are all interpenetrating moments, as Engels would say in the Anti-Düring. And when we encounter bourgeois naturalism, we'll come back to this again and again, we come back to some version of lifeboat ethics, of course, from the right-wing eugenics theorist Garrett Hardin. You know him from the Tragedy of the Commons, also lifeboat ethics. And this is not a very interesting statement. It is something familiar to all of us. I want to highlight this as a historical expression of a long Malthusian cycle. And I'll be talking about that at some length in over the next 45 minutes. So this is always the case against helping the poor. Hardin was completely unoriginal and fairly ignorant of anything that had to do with actual commons or actual enclosures or anything historical at all. In fact, what he says is almost word for word updated for 1974, what Malthus writes in the second essay on Nature's Mighty Feast. And we'll come back to this, but Malthus was not writing at a moment of overpopulation in England. He was writing at a moment of agricultural productivity crisis and of a demographic transition induced by the widespread proletarianization of labor over the previous century or so, which had germinated by the time Malthus is writing into a proto-socialist radicalism, both in the cities, London in particular, and in the countryside. So Malthus writes, well, if the society doesn't want his labor, he has no claim to subsistence. That's the essence of it. And so we are totally justified in refusing to allow these lazy, unemployed people to sit at the table of nature's mighty feast. Now, this is important because this kind of thinking underpins the Anthropocene as a kind of Anthropocene ideological complex. But what's important about Malthus is not simply that they had terrible ideas in service of empire and class rule, but that he is using nature and good science to justify inequality and exploitation. Malthus is also writing during the last and most intense span of the Little Ice Age, which begins in 1300. We'll come back to that. Between 1783 and 1820, 1821, more or less. So he's writing in one of these unfavorable moments of climate change that is, not coincidentally, bound up with the world revolution of the West. Widespread social revolt from Haiti to Ireland, France to New England, within the English countryside, as I just mentioned, where food riots are so-called, are asserting the right to subsistence. Malthus's text has nothing, by the way, to do with environment. It is the deployment of man, nature, and civilization to justify and enable class exploitation and equality. Its core premises are nature and the civilizational imperative to regulate and rationalize natural law. This is precisely what we see today with the Anthropocene, with people like Johann Rockström and planetary boundaries. These are not abstractly scientific statements. They are ideological statements and political projects of planetary management. Even before Malthus, though, we have the invention of man, nature, and civilizations. Marx and Engels called them ruling ideas. I like to call them ruling abstractions for reasons I can tease out a little bit more in the question and answer. But essentially, these are abstractions that make their way into the cultural premises of capitalism as usual. And drawing on Marx and Sylvia Wynter and many others, we can see that humanity and civilization were these ruling abstractions that allowed bourgeoisies and empires in particular to transform potential human labor into nature and therefore to suppress their consumption through formally unpaid systems of work. So women's work was an invention of the period after 1550. The invention of race comes very, very slowly and not after 1570 or so, and its raw material is nature. It's the same with women. It's in gender. The invention of gender is an invention of bourgeois naturalism. That's crucial because we want to be able to make sense of how the bourgeoisie tells us to make sense of man and nature. Man and nature are not about man and nature. They are about cheap labor, cheap natures of all kinds, including centrally labor, and above all, class power and the power of ideology. So broadly speaking, this is a Gramscian framing of the geoculture of modernity, if it helps to put it in more critical theoretical language. But really, we're dealing with bourgeois ideology through naturalism. And it's very deeply committed to reducing the web of life to a series of substances. Of course, the point of all of this is not growth. It's not industrialization. It is to advance the rate of profit. And I hear critical theorists all the time saying, well, it's more complicated than that. Well, it is a very complex phenomena, and no, it is not more complicated than that. The central overriding drive of social actors in historical capitalism is the rate of profit and the accumulation of capital. Behavior that runs contrary to the accumulation of capital is weeded out or ruthlessly suppressed, as with the socialist revolutions of the 20th century, and behavior that corresponds to and advances capitalism as a system of cheap nature is rewarded. So let's now keep all of that in mind as we go to reflect upon the long Malthusian cycle. Just remember, this is the recurrence and reinvention of naturalism, of imperial naturalism during periods of worldwide revolt, war, migration, and almost always unfavorable climate change. And you can see by the periodization here that these are moments of profound class revolt and the emergence of socialist and national liberation challenges to imperial capitalism again and again through the longue durée. We'll come back to this. The Anthropocene is, of course, the latest expression of the Malthusian cycle that began with Paul Ehrlich in 1968, the first Earth Day in 1970, the first Stockholm UN Stockholm Conference on the Environment in 1972. All of that is the era of spaceship Earth. The Anthropocene is the neoliberal incarnation or reinvention of spaceship Earth. And the Anthropocene is not about man and nature. It's not about sustainability. It is an ideological claim about controlling planetary life and about human and extra-human work, and for whose benefit all of that will be done. It is, in short, a strategy of planetary management. Now, there are different inflections of this strategy in the present moment. We can come back to that. But let's keep in mind that these Malthusian moments are closely and intimately connected with migration. Of course, the figure on the top refers only to Europe. The cross-border migration from East and South Asia was equally, if not more, significant during the period after the 1870s up to World War I. This is the era, of course, of eugenics. Eugenics is in response to much more than just migration, but that is a key moment. It is effectively a response to the challenges of consolidating the new imperialism of the late 19th century and the massive proletarianization of not only Eastern and Southern Europe, but also of East Asia. And so this is also unfolding in the present moment. You can see this is a very conservative count of the migrant share of population rises. I'm sure there are experts who can, in the audience, who can speak much more empirically to why this is an understatement of the uptick in the migrant percentage of the world's population. But in essence, what we are seeing is the very, very tight correlation between cross-border migration, itself an expression of dispossession and proletarianization, and the sustainability project. Here I draw, this is a very simple chart from Richard Freeman that has circulated for nearly 20 years. It's crucial. We want to understand that also after the 1980s, with the overthrow of the Soviet Union and the sort of rise of China as a capitalist industrializer, as well as the end of national developmentalism in places like India, you have a massive expansion of the world's proletariat, inducing a downward revision of the capital labor ratio, which, as any good Marxist will tell you, is favorable to a revival of the rate of profit. Now, what's interesting is that profitability did not actually increase very much at all, and by 2003, we have signs of an impending global financial crisis that comes to the fore in 2008. So from this standpoint, we want to be able to understand the Rockstrom planetary boundaries, limits to growth framing. Remember, this is simply a new incarnation of 1972's limits to growth. And it's not that there aren't limits, it's that the limits are geohistorical, and to present as Marx would say, an abstractly material or a one-sided representation of the problem presents the nature of the solutions as fundamentally anti-democratic, technoscientific, and geomanagerialist, rather than resting on widespread and thorough democratization. It is about the control not only of the proletariat conventionally understood, but, as I have argued now for many years, that paid work finds as its necessary condition socially necessary unpaid work of femitariat and biotariat, not as separate units, not as building blocks, but as interpenetrating moments, that we are all proletarian, femitarian, and biotarian, in the present conjuncture. But to understand how capitalism creates its own gravediggers, we need to go beyond the narrow Eurocentric formalism that has come into favor over recent years. We should situate this class dynamic as including both the movements and moments of socially necessary labor time and socially necessary unpaid work. Of course, capitalism must commodify and undermine the sources, the bases of socially necessary unpaid work. And that's at the taproot of, in many ways, the taproot of push factors in migration, but also of the present epochal crisis of capitalism. So in contrast to the Anthropocene representation, and indeed the representation of virtually all eco-socialists, I would say that instead of a man and nature conflict, an account of climate change as anthropogenic, we need to put climate, class, and capital together in a dialectical explanation. So there's a singular crisis with a crisis of life-making and a crisis of profit-making. These are both unfolding at the same time. From this standpoint, and from this longer historical standpoint, we can ask questions like, is the present crisis a developmental crisis, one that will be resolved through new rounds of primitive accumulation, or is it an epochal crisis of capitalism as a world ecology of power, profit, and life? And as some may know, my position has moved increasingly towards an emphasis on yes to the second. It is an epochal crisis. We are living in a moment of zombie capitalism, where capitalism's underlying sources of dynamism and vitality are now gone. But, and it's an important but, it lives on as and is very deadly in terms of the world around us. In my view, capitalism is now morphing into a system of political accumulation. So in spirit, but certainly not the letter, I would agree with folks as diverse as Varoufakis and Bob Brenner on this specific point. And in fact, Gennaro translated my essay on imperialism with and without cheap nature for the new book in Italian. So our challenge is at the most simple level to integrate these geological tipping points, biophysical tipping points, we're all familiar with this, with geohistorical tipping points, the long run decline in the world rate of profit. The mass of profit is a different question. The ongoing long run, several decades now, stagnation of agricultural productivity. Fully 8 years of agricultural productivity have already been lost owing to climate change. According to the OECD, world agriculture will absorb half of all costs related to climate change by 2050, which is not that far away. And that will, putting those moments together, understanding there is a singular crisis with differential expressions, I think is fundamental and gives us a political vision that is entirely separate from the left Keynesian view of polycrisis, as Tooze says, or converging crises. There is a singular crisis with many expressions, but at its core is a crisis of the reproduction of planetary life and a reproduction of global capital, which depends upon new frontiers of cheap labor, food, energy, and raw materials. So this allows us to get beyond social reductionism and environmental determinism. This begins to focus on a critique of bourgeois naturalism because it is literally all around us, and it feeds into extremely dangerous kinds of politics. For instance, in Latin America, while there are different inflections of this phrase, the way that scholars like Mignolo have picked up on the defense of life territories, that is blood and soil nationalism. We see Latour at the end of his life in Down to Earth talking about defending the European homeland. So there has always been a strain running through naturalisms of various kinds of the homeland ecologies of Heidegger and Lovelockian Malthusianism. So once again, we are looking at a crisis of life-making and profit-making in their totalities, not as separate entities, but as interrelated moments of the present crisis. That leads us to ask about the precise character of the present crisis. And when we address that question, is it developmental? Is it epical? We need to look at history. And what happens most of the time is social scientists and people on the left ask questions that are essentially speculative. And here's the virtue of historical materialism. It's historical. And it understands that praxis is not only about what is happening right now, but praxis is also about the retrodictive analysis of what happened in the history of capitalism in order to understand the continuities, but also the ruptures in the worldwide class struggle in the web of life. So that's the centrality of a world historical perspective, as Marx and Engels remind us to embrace in the German ideology. The proletariat, as they correctly point out, can only exist world historically, and so too the transition from capitalism to socialism and thence to communism. Now, a key moment of the present reality is the ideological specter of climate doomism, that climate is an existential threat, and that has taken all the oxygen out of the ideological and political and analytical recognition that unfavorable climate changes are bad for ruling classes. Here, I'm just going to run through this very fast, but I feel like we have to have a sense of these histories. These are snapshots from the crisis of feudalism, from the crisis of the late 18th century that we talked about with Malthus, the Haitian Revolution, and then, of course, a very stylized picture of the Goths crossing the Danube. Now, I won't go into great detail because there's simply not enough time, but the overthrow of the Western Roman Empire was not driven by the migration of Central Eurasian peoples, but that was a part of the story. And indeed, the Goths were pushed to the west by the Huns in a period, this is the 4th century, in a period of the worst Eurasian steppe drought over the past 2,000 years. And indeed, these movements of peoples and the social dislocations involved were intimately tied to climate, and of course to the way in which climate and class and social organization are all fitting together. 2 years after the Goths crossed the Danube, they are engaged in an armed uprising that then mobilizes the working classes of Thrace and other elements in the eastern, in the Greek, Macedonian, Albanian region. This is not just a barbarian invasion, but a social revolt where the Goths defeat the Roman legions at Adrianople in 378, and they burn Emperor Valens alive. As far as I'm concerned, he got what was coming to him. In any event, we want to keep this climate, class, and geography nexus, the movements of people, of power, of capital, of commodities, at the center of our attention. Secondly, let's remember that this today is not the first capitalogenic climate crisis. That was the outcome of the great genocides of the New World, which were driven not solely by microbes, but by the slaving, the cheap nature raiding of the Iberian conquerors under the pretext of just war. And so the thirst for cheap nature led to the decimation of indigenous peoples. Soils absorbed carbon, forests grew back, and the result was what Lewis and Maslin call the Orbis spike, contributing to the most severe long period of the Little Ice Age between roughly 1550 and 1700. Well, this was in the long, cold 17th century, the origins of climate class divide, climate patriarchy, and climate apartheid. And those are all centrally labor questions. Patriarchy and apartheid are the outgrowth of naturalism, of what I've called bourgeois Prometheanism, that had to emerge first. Before there could be racism and sexism, there had to be, in a modern sense, there had to be naturalism, which is ultimately about the control of labor and the cheapening of labor. This also sheds fundamentally new and different light on bourgeois arguments about population. They ignore entirely Marx's famous sort of essay or chapter on population, which is on the general law of capitalist accumulation. That long chapter in Capital, right before primitive accumulation, that we need to understand that there are special laws of population that obtain according to the class dynamics of modes of production in different times and places. So here I'm just going to run through just to give you a few snapshots in your head. This is from the Bronze Age so-called collapse and climate change, in which migration, famine, drought, war, revolt all came together in a very tight period. Archaeologists think perhaps 75 years, right around the year 1200. The Egyptians survived, and pretty much everyone else did not. We can get into the details if you're curious about this. Here again is the summary of these key moments of, over the past 2,000 years, key moments of unfavorable climate change that are wrapped up with class revolt, imperial restructuring, epochal crisis, and all of this. So what I say about climate is basically this. Climate is not everything. Climate is not a deus ex machina, but you cannot understand anything about the history of class society over the longue durée without climate. Climate is a key moment in, if you will, the DNA of class societies, which are fundamentally socio-metabolic. Here again, the rise and fall of Rome, which I've hinted at, had everything to do with the warming of the North and Central Europe to enjoy a Mediterranean climate. When that began to change after the year 300, depending on who you look at, then increasing crises, political as well as economic and military, began to ensue. So here again is the key dynamic of a kind of climate migration process that is wrapped up with epochal crisis in Western Rome. Of course, in the East it survives. We can get into why that is as well. So in sum, when you have moments of unfavorable climate shift, you can see that there tends to be a crisis of the existing class order. The crude mechanism for this is agricultural productivity and the inflexibility of class society around that. And that obviously has dramatic parallels for the present moment. When the climate is very unfavorable, the class structure tends to flatten. So with the overthrow of the Roman Empire, peasants reestablished a peasant mode of production, drawing on the work of the brilliant Chris Wickham. As the climate began to warm, the conditions for wresting agricultural surplus eased, and that allowed for the resurgence of a feudal, or the reinvention of the aristocracy into a feudal aristocracy, and the subsequent caging of the peasantry right around the year 1000. Here, we just need to be aware that class and climate dynamics are intimately connected, even when the climate changes are not socially forced, let's put it that way. So in other words, historical materialism needs to reckon not only with dialectical contradictions, for instance, in agriculture and soil fertility and labor productivity, but also with how all of those social contradictions I just mentioned are wrapped up with non-dialectical contradictions: volcanic activity, solar cycles, orbital variations, Milankovitch cycles in other ways, that these are that what historical materialism in the web of life allows us to do is to make sense of those intimate connections between dialectical and non-dialectical contradictions. So again, the crisis of feudal Europe is not a Malthusian crisis. It's not too many people on the land because they exceeded the carrying capacity. That's a bourgeois claim, but rather it is a class historical conjuncture. And it is one that should give us a considerable optimism for the present moment. This was an era, the long 14th century, the dawn of the Little Ice Age. Feudalism was not brought down by bad climate. Feudalism was essentially defeated by the peasantries and urban working classes of Western Europe who refused to accommodate a feudal move to restructure feudalism and go back to an earlier brutal model of the feudal mode of production. Instead, they were soundly defeated and forced to look overseas for a solution to their problem. So again, this is a climate class conjuncture. In the context of labor and mobility, we can see that the emerging synthesis was there from the very beginning, as Raj Patel and I have written about. The conquest of Granada involved the here you have a stylized painting of Ferdinand and Isabella overseeing the enslavement of every single one of Malaga's Jewish and Muslim inhabitants. That Christopher Columbus was present here, and this dynamic of credit, of conquest, of coerced labor began at the very, very moment of the rise of capitalism. And that was central to the whole dynamic of imperialist accumulation and using capital, science, and empire to put the work of the web of life in service to capital accumulation and to the new empires, which were, by the way, chronically indebted and therefore always serving the bankers. As I mentioned, the genocides that followed are very much the result of a drive for cheap labor, so very much following from the model established in Malaga in 1487. You can see here from the work of Koch and his colleagues that the flashpoints of commodity production and exchange in 16th and 17th century Americas were also the flashpoints of the Great Dying. This is a horrific story. It leads, as I mentioned, to the Orbis spike, the drawdown of carbon dioxide and the contribution, and in the process contributing a capitalogenic forcing to the crisis of the long, cold 17th century. The solution was found in this climate trinity of climate apartheid, climate patriarchy, and the climate class divide. So this is a hugely important moment that we just want to keep in mind, because this is really where every single significant element of so-called mature capitalism comes from in this era of the long, cold 17th century. It is the moment of the Lockean Cartesian revolution that establishes the civilizing project and the management of labor as central. For Descartes, I think, therefore I am, was of thinking essences and extended essences. It's a managerial philosophy. For Locke, it was about improvement and the civilizing project. And these different moments of the Cartesian revolution succeed each other, but the old moment is not displaced. The Cartesian Lockean revolution continues in the Malthusian moment, continues in the eugenics revolution, and continues in the spaceship Earth Anthropocene environmentalism of the rich moment. The solution to the genocides of the New World, which were not a problem for the civilizers, except that they needed people to work for very, very low cost. They needed cheap labor. So the solution was found in moving people. This is not exactly the migration as we think about it, but coercive, violent migration and the assignment of those people to less than human, subhuman status goes back to this period, the dawn of the Atlantic slave trade and the most intense period of the long, cold 17th century sync up perfectly. This is the planetary logic of ecogenocide, but also the planetary logic of the accumulation of capital and the specific forms of class formation that it implies. The slave was a proletarian. And it draws our attention as well to the ways that modern power is fundamentally oriented towards political solutions. So the bourgeoisie, Joseph Schumpeter once said, is basically powerless to produce the conditions for a good business environment. What it needs is imperial power. So there is always a very dynamic moment of political accumulation and geopolitical accumulation pulsing through the arteries of value accumulation. Again, this is how capital wants to fix its problems, by a commitment to military power. That's going to have relevance as we come to the closing elements of this talk. This is simply to remind all of you that the essential global infrastructure of capitalist power was established during this period of climate change, that the crises that associated with the long, cold 17th century were resolved by going to new frontiers of cheap nature and wresting the cheap labor, food, energy, and raw materials from those new frontiers. It was accompanied, as we know, by it was not just accompanied, but enabled by a civilizing project, a reassertion of the man and nature dualism, the ruling ideas, the ruling abstractions of its time. Again, we are here with the long Malthusian cycle. This recurs again and again. And this allows us to begin to see how the genesis of climate crisis today is not about fossil fuels. The slogan of fossil capital is a dangerous and counterproductive and, dare I say, anti-Marxist slogan because it reifies the substance. It is not that burning fossil fuels doesn't vaporize carbon and send it into the atmosphere. That, of course, is a fact, but it is a basic fact and not a geohistorical fact. That resources, from the standpoint of Marxist materialism, resources become, and they become through the relations of class and capital and empire. So from this standpoint, what matters are the social organizations of production and empire that are in the web of life, and the securing of cheap natures through a cheap nature strategy. This has the implication that today's crisis is crisis is the result of how capitalism went about fixing its climate crisis in the 17th century. That's fundamental. And to begin to create systems of unpaid work and paid work in their dialectical contradictions. So finally, we want to recall that Malthusianism, and that's really where present-day environmentalism gets its theory, is a class and ideological theory of how man and nature are governed by enlightened people like Thomas Malthus. And the decisive element of Malthusianism is not about abstract population. That's a moment of it, but it's about abstract nature, ahistorical nature. So, for instance, eugenics, an abstract and ahistorical theory of human nature, was invoked in the late 19th century and indeed becomes central to the reinvention of neo-Malthusianism after World War II, with people like Huxley saying, well, we know the Nazis gave eugenics a bad name, but really we just need a better eugenics. And this is intimately tied to, again, the theme of today around labor and migration, to displacement and ethnocide and the creation of spaces of accumulation, in this case, displacing indigenous peoples so that the cotton gin and massive expansion of slavery could occur in the frontier zones of the American South. It was this, the cotton gin, the second slavery, the new racism of the time, not the steam engine that drives the Industrial Revolution. That's very, very important. This is, by the way, Marx's position as well, that cheap cotton is essentially the enabling factor for the large-scale industry. Everybody disregards it. In fact, he's well supported now by generations of economic historians. And this allows us to begin to think about the displacement and movement of labor, the displacement of indigenous peoples, the movement of slave working classes into the frontier zones of the American South as fundamental to a dynamic, a frontier dynamic to produce cheap cotton, the decisive raw material of the Industrial Revolution. In other words, plantation revolution drives the Industrial Revolution. What people talking about the plantationocene don't understand is the plantation was how empire and capital organized the worldwide class struggle. It was not an apparatus of white supremacy. That is a completely mistaken view. White supremacy emerges out of that process. It is a result of that process and not a cause of it. So to conclude, a few basic reflections. First of all, in world ecology, the project of cheap nature has multiple dimensions. It is economic, that is about cheapening in price of basic inputs for capital. But that economic moment relating to Schumpeter's comment is also political and geocultural. The cheap nature pivots on the cheapening, the devaluation in an ethico-political sense of potential cheap labor, women, nature, and colonies, in Maria Mies's famous formulation. It is also political in the very direct sense that empire and colonialism, the system of imperialism, is the bourgeoisie's preferred mode of waging the class war under capitalism. And finally, the capitalism is not a narrowly conceived economic system, although it includes a logic of MCM prime, for sure, but that it booms when there are pockets or islands of commodification within oceans of potential cheap nature, of socially necessary unpaid work that are provided not just by coal seams and oil fields, but also by humans, designated as nature in the ideological offensives of the world bourgeoisie. Here is a simplistic illustration. This is when capitalism booms. You have an island of the cash nexus of the circuit of capital, and it depends upon imperialism and political power to suck in cheap natures necessary to the accumulation of capital. And that every great wave of capitalism goes through this cycle of the rise and fall of the four cheaps, dependent upon, at every turn, new frontiers. Well, what happens when the frontiers are gone? Well, that's what we're seeing today. And we're seeing the double closure of frontiers, not just the closure of labor, food, energy, and raw material frontiers, but also the closure of the waste frontier and the reckoning, the economic reckoning of the final enclosure of the atmospheric commons through greenhouse gases. What does this lead to? Well, it leads to a situation uncomfortably analogous to that of the world before World War I. Of course, this is much more complex in many ways, and the climate conjuncture lends a new intensity to all these contradictions that scholars like Luxemburg and Lenin grappled with quite famously. There is unquestionably, you know this in the EU much better than I do, a move towards what the Transnational Institute calls the global climate wall. It is an unprecedented militarization of borders. It leads to, many of you, like I said, are much more familiar with this, to a border industrial complex. This is centered in the United States. I'm sure there is an identical chart to be made for the European Union, for Australia, and all of these other moments. The point, of course, is not to halt migration. The point is to secure cheap labor at a moment when cheap labor frontiers are increasingly exhausted by many different dynamics. And of course, finally, as Lenin recognized before World War I, that the world was approaching a moment of the wars of redivision. Of course, you know in Europe that Germany is in the midst of the greatest rearmament campaign since 1936. We know that EU diplomats like Josep Borrell, many of you are familiar with this quotation, that the European Union is the garden and everywhere else is the jungle. This could have been said in the 18th century, and everybody would have thought that was a beautiful turn of phrase. We know that this is related to the long-standing representation of man and nature and the designation of challengers to imperialism as savage, as wild, as warlike, as uncivilized, etc. So what we're in the midst of is, I believe, the opening stages of World War III, Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, West Africa, in Taiwan and China, with U.S. provocation. We are in the middle of this massive rearmament campaign that is intimately tied to the question of climate, of borders, and labor. So now we have reached the end of our talk. Let's remember that moments of unfavorable climate change are moments characterized by political and geopolitical crisis, including war. They are moments characterized by the migration of peoples. They are moments characterized by either developmental or epochal crises of varied civilizations. Let's remember, environmentalism is not about the environment, it's about class power. This is the environmentalism of the rich, as Martina Zalier said. It is the most recent expression of the long Malthusian cycle. Man, nature, and civilization are not innocent. They are ideological constructs. They are ruling abstractions that legitimate good science, or the scientization of politics, as Habermas once said. Migration, climate change, and the Malthusian cycle, the ideological cycle, have been fundamentally entwined and fundamental as a whole to the history of capitalism. Some of you read my essay on the implosion, the great implosion of capitalism. The end of cheap natures means the end of capitalism. It means zombie capitalism, or Gramsci's morbid symptoms. That doesn't mean collapse, by the way. It could very well mean what the masters of mankind since the 1970s have wanted, the restructuring of the world political economy to maintain existing inequalities of wealth and power while dealing with the climate crisis. And finally, the epochal crisis of capitalism signals a renewed drive to world war, itself an expression of the worldwide class struggle and the imperial drive to control labor, and the other cheap natures, hence the centrality of borders and migration in today's geopolitics. Thank you very much.
Okay, Jason, many thanks.
We need to think big. We need to think as big as possible.
Yeah. 2,000 years of history. Great. Okay, a very strong and in the long run history presentation. Questions and commentaries and critiques are open now. You have to open your microphone if you want. If someone wants to speak with Jason, it's sufficient to open your microphone. Okay. I think we need some seconds. Just
take a deep breath.
Oh,
find a coffee.
Very good, very great. Because your presentation is focused on modernity, but with a very large history.
Well, if we want to understand climate, then we have to understand the stabilization of Holocene climate about 7,000 years ago. And that's the outcome of class society. So as Marx would remind us, we are living in the long era of class
Yeah,
society.
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But for example, Arianna, that is a PhD student in this PhD program, and I am a tutor of PhD project of Arianna, wrote me, uh, I need 1 minute, also for a cigarette. I wrote a lot during Jason's presentation, but my hand stopped. It was impossible.
Good.
Okay.
Good. You need a strong hand.
Mariana, sorry, but I share with with everyone your messages.
Is your
Okay.
hand okay, Ariana?
Jason,
Yeah.
I have the first question because I remember that we share an article with people that participate in this seminar series. Your paper on climate, class, and grid frontier. In this paper, we have a part of issue that you have developed in your presentation. I have two questions. The first one is about imperialism, because I think that in your work, especially in the last 5 years, perhaps with a lot of links with Arrighi, maybe, the issue of imperialism became fundamental, more than in the past. I think in your work, I think in your elaboration. I think it's my interpretation of your publication and work and conversation. Okay, and so the first question is about the relationship between imperialism, frontiers, and migration. Because you say that imperialism is linked to world class formation. Okay.
Precisely.
So imperialism is a force, a military issue, but it is also a socio-political issue. No, a socio-political imperialism has socio-political and class consequences. No, at world level. So my first question is if you can help us to better understand the relationship between imperialism, frontiers, and migration. It's a great question, maybe. But
it's a fantastic question. I think we want to begin with history, and we also want to recognize that we do not have an adequate theory of imperialism in the web of life. And the ways in which that question has been dealt are problematic. So let me go back to the question, however, that every era of capitalism depends upon a new imperialism. Many people will be familiar with David Harvey's book of that term to talk about the neoliberal moment of the new imperialism. Yes. As he knew, as I knew, that was a play on an older historiography that emphasized the new imperialism of the period roughly between 1883, the conference in Berlin, and the outbreak of World War I. That was, for most of the 20th century, that was the new imperialism that historians wrote about. Before then, there were other key moments of new imperialisms. What did they all have in common? Well, one key moment of that is world class formation and world proletarianization. This is very evident in the dynamics of the climate fix of the long, cold 17th century. The creation of African labor forces under a slave regime, of coercive wage labor relations in places like colonial Peru or the Valley of Mexico, of coercive gendered proletarianization within Europe, the Silvia Federici story. And what I feel like I need to emphasize is that even Marxists forget Marxism is a critique of methodological individualism. The proletarian condition is not something that adheres to the individual. Proletarianization flows through households and families. And so the so-called sort of Fordist auto worker and the so-called Fordist housewife was not a question of a proletarian and a non-proletarian. They share a proletarian relation to the dynamics of class exploitation and social reproduction. They are differentiated. So always, always, always differentiated unities for Marxism. This was also the case, of course, as you know, in Italy. The new imperialism of the late 19th century was also the moment of rapid agrarian change throughout Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, the rapid proletarianization, the displacement and proletarianization of people, and many of them went to North America, many of them went to South America as well. So a moment of worldwide proletarianization. Now, you'll be forgiven if this has never occurred to you, or not you, Gennaro, but to the audience in David Harvey's account, because I love David and he's brilliant, and you can't have an account of the new imperialism without an account of proletarianization. And that's the point of the Richard Freeman graph of the Great Doubling, that the moment of the new imperialism was occasioned, was not just accompanied by, but actually propelled the worldwide proletarianization of labor, the massive expansion of the active and reserve armies of labor in, I don't want to say unprecedented ways, but truly in epical fashion that created the cheap labor conditions for neoliberal, for the golden age of neoliberal accumulation, let us say between the early 90s and the late 2000s. So these are all intimately connected, and then it turns out they are all intimately connected to various forms of environment making and environmental change. So we can't conceptualize either imperialism or class formation, which also includes bourgeoisification. Nobody wants to use that word anymore, but that's a real thing, capitalist class formation. That's what primitive accumulation was also about in Marx. Many critical theorists, critical social scientists just pretend that's not a thing. And that absolutely is a thing. So it's not just proletarianization, but bourgeoisification on a world scale. And then I think we need to be very serious about imperialism. Nobody takes seriously the theory of imperialism in any sense anymore. Much of it has degenerated into a form of what I call, at least in the left academia, into a form of a kind of subaltern clash of civilizations thinking, in which the conflict is between different racial and ethnic groups. And I'm sorry, the Europeans did not conquer the world. The capitalists conquered the world. The capitalists and their empires conquered the world and then redefined what they were doing as European, which did not include most people who we might think of as European today. So we need to go deeply into a historical appreciation in order to understand why the same strategies of imperialism are in motion today, but without cheap nature, it will lead to only more war. And I think that's just the reality that we're confronting. And we see this in the absolutely frightening rhetoric of the European foreign policy and military establishment, not only Josep Borrell, but also like Florenz Gaub in the early months of the U.S., NATO, Russia war in Ukraine, saying, well, the Russians might look like us, Germans, but they don't value life in the same way. This has been said about every imperialist, this has been said by every major imperialist ideologue ever. The Arabs don't value life. The Africans don't value life. The Chinese don't value life. Nope. Gennaro,
Jason, and the other question that I have, okay, I have another question, and stop me. If you can explain in your interpretation the relationship between chip for production and also chip for crisis and the current migration management based on militarization of borders.
I mean, I think it's an indirect relation.
You know that in Italy and Europe is a fundamental question.
Right. No. I mean, it depends what they mean by cheap, or what you mean by cheap food. So the question of cheap food is about the reproduction of labor power.
Okay.
Now, of course, what we've seen across the global South, and Gennaro, you can speak to this far more knowledgeably than I, are widespread dispossessions, land grabs, etc. But I would look at what is happening in the Mediterranean as the outcome of American regime change politics, even more than any direct agricultural project of securing land. So the U.S. NATO destruction of Libya, once the most prosperous country in Africa, now there are open slave markets on the streets of Benghazi. The attempt to overthrow Assad in Syria. Now, never mind the decades-long systematic destruction of Afghanistan, Iraq, which is a little bit more removed from the Mediterranean, I realize. But all of these dynamics, the price of food, and maybe that's what you're getting at, the price of food and political stability are intimately connected. So that's a dimension of it. Maybe I'm missing something from your question, but I think systemically, there's been a huge drive to, of course, dispossess peasants worldwide. That's been a huge thing. Farshad Araghi and many other people have spoken of a great displacement. And so I think the cheap food moment comes in around proletarianization and efforts of the new border industrial complexes to ensure that migrant labor is suppressed, and also that people, this is the case in the United States, the working people blame their problems on migrants instead of the capitalist class.
Okay, please. I stopped with my question. I had a lot of questions, always with Jen.
You can argue, you can yell at me, you can do anything you want.
Well, if I may, I have a question.
Luca, hi.
Hi. Just a curiosity more than a question. You talked about Heidegger's philosophy as in homeland ecology. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that. Thank you.
Well, so for those of you who don't know, Heidegger was a very famous continental philosopher. He was also a member of the Nazi Party. He never apologized for being a member of the Nazi Party, and had a conception of nature based on dwelling. Here I'm summarizing, Luca, you surely know this better than I do, but this is fundamentally an anti-working class view of the web of life. It is a form of naturalism that fits very well not only in the German tradition. Let's remember that Haeckel, who coins the term ecology, also leads the German Monist League in the early 20th century, which Gassman calls a proto-Nazi ideology, and is intimately tied to Ratzel's geopolitics and his conception of Lebensraum as well. In the United States, it takes somewhat different forms, but it is also premised on eugenics and both strains, but especially conservationism in the United States. The leading figure, Gifford Pinchot, in the late 19th and early 20th century, a ruling class figure, is also a major eugenicist, supporter of that. So these views of saving nature for the value of nature in its own sake, which have gone through much of the the environmentalism of the rich since 1970, I see as fundamentally anti-working class. And for this reason, there's a different history of environmentalism in Italy. I know this. But in the United States and Germany, many places like this, but especially in the United States, working class environmental problems were not environmental problems, according to environmentalists. So there's a deeper sort of love of nature, and we're going to go and commune with the trees, and that's somehow going to lead to a worldview that is in harmony with nature. It's a thoroughly bourgeois view. It's anti-working class. And let me say a caveat. I like to go out and be with the trees. I like the quiet. I like to be out in outdoor nature. Okay, so I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm saying that if you turn it into a politics, it is always a bad thing.
Tonia? Tonia? Tonia, please. There is a text by Tonia.
Hi, Tonia. Oh, your microphone.
Oh, Tonia, il microfono.
Can you hear me? Good afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon.
Yeah, I would say it's a really interesting reconstruction view as a materialistic interpretation of the economical history. So it's been amazing how you taken from above 2,000 years ago reconstructs briefly all the relationship between men's and power and economy. So I would say really, really interesting to be it need time to be assimilated. Was a lot of notions. Really, really thank you for that. It wasn't a question, but was an appreciation about your work and your capacity of, touching all the subjects. I would say really, really interesting.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. We need to develop I think out of historical materialism, in my view, a labor theory of life, which gives us a labor theory of life that is also a perspective on socialist revolution.
Yeah, that would be very interesting to extend the analysis to the political action. So what to do in order to actually improve the economy and the quality of life of people at the moment. So looking at what's happening in the world about wars and powers, the equilibrium of powers that it needs to be redefined, my advice.
Absolutely.
Ines.
Hi everyone.
Hi,
Thank you
Ines.
for this conversation. I think it's very interesting, especially in my context. I'm from Argentina, where Marxism in this moment is the main enemy. Like everything is Marxism. But my question is about another thing. I was thinking about the colonial lecture, the readings, which they say like. It's not only the labor class, the relations of labor, but also this epistemicide. I don't know if it says like this. So I don't know if you can talk something, maybe it's a big broad, but something about that, because I think also indigenous people have this key ontological, political that can also give a solution maybe with its climate crisis.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that my disagreement with many people on the academic left is fairly simple. Indigenous peoples are not outside of class society. And yet, less so in Latin America. So the Latin Americans are much better on this. But in North America, indigenous peoples are magical ecological creatures with special wisdom that they can present to good environmentalists and college professors to become more enlightened. It's astounding to me. This is essentially in the North American context, and I want to speak to epistemicide in just a moment, but in the North American context, this has been the rehabilitation of an older racist trope of the ecological Indian, which of course is, you know, the noble savage and the oscillations in Western culture that go back and forth between denouncing and embracing the noble savage. And it's fundamentally rooted in the civilizing project. And indeed, I think most of the invocations in North America around decoloniality are explicitly anti-communist. Mignolo is a great example of this. Explicitly anti-communist, anti-Marxist, anti-working class. Escobar is in there as well. I've written about that. Now, in terms of epistemicide, which is sort of even difficult for me to say, that is a class project. That is the fundamental cultural logic of the imperial bourgeoisie from the era of, I mean, yes, sort of from Columbus, but really from the Cartesian Revolution and its specific inflections of in the Spanish Empire in the colonial era. So the reason why you build churches and schools and all the rest is to ideologically indoctrinate and cleanse the population of their old beliefs. That's a class project. And this is I think the utility of Marxism as a revolutionary theory, that it understands class as an ontological premise that then gives rise to various geocultural, political, ideological expressions. So capitalism is not an economic system that does all these terrible things. It is a class system that creates the dynamic of the circuit of capital. And so I'm rather distressed. And then I'm also distressed, and I see this across Latin America as well as in North America, the tendency of the so-called social movement left to absolutely abandon the centrality of state power. And we all see let's look at what happens when the left is defeated in its political project. Look at El Salvador, this post-neoliberal prison hellscape, or look at the many other places around Latin America that we have to, any revolutionary project has to include a political project to gain and keep state power, or you can go nowhere.
Ok, Ufer. Ciao, Ufer. Oh, Jenny, no, Jenny. Okay. And to Jason, I think that you share a lot you share a part of your theoretical and interpretation elements with some decolonial thinkers. Not all the colonial movement, not all the colonial approach, but you know that's for thinkers in the colonial approach. For example, Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui say, or Ramon Grossfogel in different ways say, okay, but Silvia Rivera say that we don't have a decolonial perspective.
Well, it's a problem, comrade, because decolonial has been used and abused.
One decolonial perspective. We don't have one decolonial perspective.
Yeah. Okay. The language of decoloniality has been abused and has been, So Quijano
for Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, decolonial is a fashion.
Yeah. So Marxists like Quijano are a problem, and they have to be sort of put over to the side. Or so people who are anti-imperialist and decolonial in the tradition of Cabral and Fanon and Wallerstein and Castro are those are unfashionable. You know, Cabral waged a revolutionary socialist national liberation struggle, and that's the farthest thing from 90% of decolonial scholars using decolonial today.
Yes. 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 Yes.
Like decoloniality is fine as long as you don't take state power. So, like in North America, people loved indigenous struggles, but when Evo Morales took power with MAS, they no longer wanted to support him.
Yes. See.
So don't talk about socialism. We can talk about decolonizing this and that all day long, but don't say the word socialism.
But for example, in Ramon Grossfogel, there is this relationship between the socialist perspective and also in problematic for example, with Venezuela, no, in some context, it's not so simple, no. The relationship with this political regime and the socialist construction. So it's not simple. And I live in Europe. And I live in Europe. I can speak about other contexts, but we not judge because I don't live it and I'm not a political militant in this context. So this is fundamental. This is fundamental. Also the respect, for people involved in very
the culture,
difficult.
the academic culture around this question, decoloniality, is very different in Europe compared to North America.
Yes. I think that is, yes. And Salvo Torre, that is with us, is writing about this. I know that he's writing a book in Italian. Hey, Salvo.
Where did you go, Salvo? Oh, you're on the train.
Yes, I'm following trains.
Jason, I have another question after Salvo. If Salvo can speak with us, because I think it's not simple speaking in the train. I'm interested in the question about that is also linked to Arianna Poletti PhD project about green transition policies and migration and displacement and people displacement. Because I think that it is a form of primitive accumulation. Green transition policies.
Yes.
A form of and so my question is about this. If you agree with this interpretation, and if you can help us to understand better this relationship.
There's clearly a project of green transition that is incubating in loosely connected but increasingly connected nodes: the World Economic Forum, the United Nations Environmental Program, think tanks and green parties. There is, in effect, an eco-industrial complex that spans the old, what used to be called the trilateral zone. So Japan, North America, the European Union. This is the core of the environmentalism of the rich. And the intention has been, really since the early 1970s, to construct geo-managerial formulas for a post-capitalist transition that will resolve the environmental problem, however that's defined, typically through forced underconsumption. I borrow Farshad Aragi's term. That was what happened under neoliberalism, but without environmentalism. So that was Africa's decade of lost development, the same thing in Latin America. And that was a period of, if you will, neoliberal degrowth in Africa and Latin America. So the intention, and this, they're very explicit about this. Now you can look at the World Economic Forum, and the people who go to it every year, like Johan Rockström, are very clear that what needs to be done is that consumption needs to be suppressed. And it's a tricky argument because some forms of consumption are socially unnecessary. So the a $10 million yacht, but a huge boat is socially unnecessary. But many forms of consumption are absolutely necessary and central to the well-being of working classes. So, Gennaro, I agree completely. The discourse on green transition is an effort. It is a form of primitive accumulation, but it's not an effective form. It does displace people, that's true, but it doesn't reestablish and renew the conditions for capital accumulation. What it's involved in, the green transition, is part of a project of the trilateral zone and the transnational capitalist class that wants to solve the climate crisis on the backs of the bottom 80% of the world's population. It is, of course, challenged by China and Belt and Road, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, most of the global South. So that's going to be the fault lines of the unfolding World War III. And we'll see more displacement accordingly. So the U.S. has not abandoned regime change. Its gamble was that it could bleed Russia dry. This is what the Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, said, that it would bleed Russia dry and therefore weaken the Chinese-Russian condominium. That's not happening. In fact, the opposite has occurred. And so there's this, and meanwhile, the Chinese are building cities inland to address rising sea level changes and all the rest of it. There are other explanations, I know, but I think the reason why the Chinese Communist Party is channeling private investments into real estate projects inland is to deal with the climate crisis. So there are different strategies in play to address the climate crisis that will become increasingly obvious. The centerpiece to this is that leftists have to stop saying that the capitalist classes cannot resolve the climate crisis. That is empirically false. They are already going about doing it. And all of this rhetoric of we have no time, we're all going to die, that is a politics of emergency that always serves the authoritarian and right forces.
Yes, but okay. No, but
I'm provoking you.
No, we haven't. No, but because from a political point of view, political speaking, there is a great problem for social movements, for socio-ecological movement, and for social movement for climate change or beyond climate change in the war regime, because in the war regime, emergency and repression are the main policies, no?
Yes.
And so, how is it possible in the war regime for social movement oriented toward climate justice or socio-ecological justice change, no? The agenda, the world agenda, the world political agenda. When we have a very clear case in in our current moment with Gaza, no? With Gaza. In Gaza we have a genocide or a mass attack to civil population, no? Okay, we can choose the category, but we have a lot of maybe an ecocide, We have mass destruction, but we have a lot of people in the world. A great part of the world public opinion oriented against Israel army, but Israel army continues without continuous without problems, no, continuous every day publishing videos, no, and say we are destroying everything in Gaza Strip, and the public opinion and the social movement are not. We are not able to stop this mass destruction. So we have a great problem for speaking politically speaking. Or politically speaking, the alternative is the China proposal, and the peace China proposal. This is the alternative. Okay.
Well, I think first of all, we need to understand that wars are profoundly destabilizing for the societies that wage them. So the U.S. war in Vietnam was not brought to an end by Russell and the Genocide Tribunal. It wasn't brought to an end by marches in Stockholm or London. It was brought to an end by the National Liberation Front struggle, by the widespread mutiny of American GIs in Vietnam, and by the fears that social revolt at home, brewing because of the war, might lead to a political situation that would unleash democratization on a serious scale. And America's ruling classes were terrified of this. This is not my interpretation. You can read their accounts of it. So the wars, you look at the end of World War I, where the German Navy and Army mutinies and brings an end to the war. Of course, the Russian Revolution involves mutinies as well, and an immediate end to the war, because the wars, especially major wars, and I think Netanyahu will discover this, breed not only social revolt in the civilian population, but demoralization and mutiny or disaffection within, in this case, the IDF. The war is not going well for the IDF. It's back to what everybody used to say about Vietnam, that the NLF, the National Liberation Front, wins if it does not lose, whereas the United States must achieve a total victory. And I don't want to draw a tight analogy between the two, because they are very, very different conflicts. But that essential insight is definitely in play. So I think the analogy, one analogy is to look at the anti-nuclear movement in the early 1980s, which was a truly mass movement. Here's the thing, that yes, it was a mass movement, but did it really have a meaningful political impact on the trajectory of the Cold War or neoliberalism? Once Gorbachev comes into power by 1985, he's ready to disarm. And so he meets with Reagan famously in Reykjavik, and they achieve historic arms reduction talk. So did the anti-nuclear movement shape it? I don't know. Was it important in other ways? Certainly. So we have, but there's, of course, an older history, Gennaro, that you and I know very well, which is the history of national liberation movements and socialist revolutions. And looking at the weak links in the chain and That's maybe an easy cliche to say, but it's a much better approach than, say, blowing up pipelines and property violence, which has always been politically disastrous for the left and has always angered working people, almost without exception. So we have, when it comes to climate justice, we have a third problem, and I'll be quiet after this. But the problem is that in the United States and in Europe, the billionaire foundations have financed climate activism on a large scale, which is a form of ideological counterinsurgency. So there's an amalgam of radical and socialist climate justice groups, and then others who are essentially liberals. And they're well funded. And you see this just with the discourse around climate justice. And none of them have a very clear strategy for political power. And those that do are like the German Greens, a warmongering party. I don't know that was a good answer, but it was an answer.
German Greens participated. That agree. Participation of Germany in the war.
The German, but this is not unusual for green politics. That's the thing. Okay, there are environmental justice movements, working class environmentalist projects. That's different. But for the mainstream environmentalism of the rich, it has always been in alignment with imperialism. This is absolutely the history of mainstream environmentalism. For your audience, it might be instructive to remember that American environmentalist groups, the major national groups, endorsed North American free trade in 1993. And that's not the only story.
Yes. According to new Jason Italian book.
Yes, it's all in there. All of these questions are in the Italian book.
Spread the word.
Because we most move beyond climate justice. I think that's that in the 60s, we said the issue is not the issue. The issue is not the issue. The core issue is about democratization.
Yes.
Of all spheres of life.
Yes, democratization. Yes. Okay, Jason. Salvo wrote me that it's impossible to join us or speak with us in the train, and so he say ciao to Jason. But I think Salvo is here joining with us, but it's very difficult to speak in the train. Okay, so are there other commentaries or questions or critiques? If no, we can. Jason, very. Thanks for this very. So I important conversation, because for scholars and for PhD students, but also for activists involved in migration studies, it's very important to have a more complex context in which develop the researchers, but also the activists. It's very important, because because in many cases we study the last 5 years, okay, but in Italy or but we need a larger historical standpoint. Okay, so veramente grazie, really thanks.
Thank you.
Now we have other four meetings in our seminar series. The next meeting is on 18 April with on Mediterranean context, focused more in Mediterranean context. And so, Jason, I will write you in the next days, because we have a paper to write for Joan Molinero.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Gennaro. Thank you to everyone. And I am honored to be in this conversation.
Ok, grazie.
Grazie.
Ciao Chiara, arrivederci. Bye bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.